Welcome to the Dugout. We're here to talk about some of the ways that our current machine of an empire is running closer and closer towards the fire and flames of overt fascism and open unity with the global fascists taking state power and wielding such machinery. Well, today I have, as always, my illustrious co-host, Prince Shakir.
I can't say I'm excited to dig into this episode, but we're here and it feels like something that should be talked and analyzed. So yeah, I mean, today's going to kind of be a general episode where we break down my thoughts around Trump's term as a president, around Project 2025, the different policies that he has spoken out about or people in his cabinet have spoken out about, and really unpacking it from a Black anarchist lens. So I hope this episode is really useful for folks that kind of want something to help orient them, kind of want a space to process things where it's not literally just worrying about who the next president is going to be and actually is looking at the conditions of what a Trump presidency will most likely look like and what are some of the organizing considerations that we can have. So we'll be talking about a bunch of things. We'll be talking about what changes we can kind of expect to see or have been talked about will happen under Trump, Trump 2.0, what some of the reasonable responses should be to these policies, and what does this moment kind of tell us. I definitely got more interested in this episode about a week or so ago when I was just kind of researching Trump's cabinet, and I learned that his cabinet is worth over $300 billion. And when you look through the different people he's picked, you have all kinds of people in tech, fucking Dogecoin people. Literally, there's going to be a new branch of government called Doge. There's Dr. Oz. Like, what the fuck? And so I think there's a very nonsensical feeling to what Trump is proposing, but also once you dig more into the policies, as Jordan was kind of saying earlier when we were doing research, it does feel a lot like things that Hitler would want.
And I say that because it's just classic fascist rhetoric. Pick your scholar. Like from Umberto to fucking George Jackson. This shit is ultra nationalist. This shit is hypercarceral. This shit is creating an in-group and out-group. We just have a very different set of class conditions in America. This sentiment has been bubbling at the foundation of this country for about to be 250 years, but the war against the colonization here has been going on longer than that. We're not going through everyone and their cabinet. One way to start this off are, what are some of the big points that you think about? I guess I'm really curious in how education and what's it called, migrancy, their policy, how the weaponized children as different ways to legitimize or find or poke holes through people's story to legally be here or not. Talking to so many people the past couple months about what a Trump 24 regime, talking to people in education, has made this shit look even starker. I'm like, the amount of college, like folks, when you fill out FAFSA, have to put in your parents' social. The folks that are helping people fill out this FAFSA are like, I can't guarantee the new Department of Education or Treasury. What about you? What are some of the things that pop into your mind?
There's a lot of things. I mean, I think as someone that's had parts of my career be in journalism, I obviously think about Trump's relationship with the mainstream media and how in a second term, I imagine the transparency and credible information that's going to be offered to the public is going to be very sparse. More media entities being banned from Trump's White House. Border is going to be a major point of contention under a Trump presidency again. His plans for denaturalization, the plans for mass deportations, probably the plans to hire more border patrol, the general umbrella of parents' rights as Trump kind of configures it in his administration. I think there's going to be a lot around marginalized identity that's just going to be scrubbed from all sorts of institutions. And it really makes me wonder how America will react to having its own evils turned against itself, I think, in a more apparent way. But yeah, I mean, yeah, the when I read about immigration and the things that they're saying and what they want to do, and if last time was bad to people immigration wise, this it's just going to be worse. And then I think about, like, if the Department of Government Efficiency office happens and all this money is plucked from other places, how much more are we going to be investing in the military and protecting our borders and all these other things? And so I think there is a lot of things shuffling around that I worry about. And then I also just anticipate, like, what the first few days will be like, and how we'll probably be able to tell a lot in the very beginning about what will be possible, or what will initially be possible.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting. I mean, the protests, what are they going to look like? How is that going to evolve? We've already seen how the mass protest scene has evolved and come in waves in the past like 20 years. But we've also seen certain, I don't know. Actually, I don't know where I'm going to go with that. I mean, one thing that's also is like the secret, not even secret, but like a lot of the times untalked about thing from regime to regime in America is private, not even private, but just the industry around carceral institutions are now also looking to be invested in heavily. GEO Group and other such folks that do both prisons, jails, and like ICE contract facilities are also like upping their investments and what they think they're going to need for transportation, possibly building tent cities. They were talking about in one of their group investor calls, not group investor calls, but board meetings, and they called them like soft cities or soft landings, or soft sites is actually I think what it was called. I mean, one aspect of what folks are going to be, what we're seeing. Let's see what the quote unquote American people or people who live on this land, like, if he's really going to try to give us hard ass austerity, Trump's going to lose a lot of that 77 that gave him where he's at. So a lot of them are single issue voters. And as soon as another issue becomes a bit more prevalent to them, fuck them up, get the tariffs going, all this other shit. People will start to realize, they start listening when you go around saying the cabinet is worth more than $300 billion. What are we doing? With the Department of Education, a lot of things have been talked about. And I think this is also one of those moments where I'm like, this is so backwards the way that Trump talks about the Department of Education. He's like, we're gonna give, education back to the states and give them the rights to choose the curriculum and have more autonomy over their budgets. And it's like, pause, 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 pause. That is literally what's happening right now. Like, there's been this rhetoric towards the federal government to go downwards towards the states for it, but also at the county and city level for it to go up to the states, reducing the like teachers' autonomy in the classroom. And alongside this whole parental rights thing, Ohio now having this new edition of the Don't Say Gay bill, which is basically if you're a mandated reporter, you have to out your fucking client, student, patient. Like, gag me. Actually, don't gag me. Actually, anyway, the way that Trump specifically talks about it, it makes me think like, oh, he doesn't know how the Department of Education works. Like, they really just they oversee some of the accreditation of universities. They make sure that funding for schools that are underfunded for local poverty reasons get federal funding, and then oversee the facilitation of FAFSA. That's The Department of Education. They don't build curriculum and send it out to the schools, and that's not where critical race theory is being shoved into your fucking child's throat. I'm doing that. That's what the dugout's for.
Some of the general things that they're kind of trying to push for in terms of changing education is like as we've talked about, closing the Department of Education, enacting universal school choice, exposing or endangering LGBTQ students in school, like we just kind of mentioned. But in terms of Trump wanting to close the Department of Education, there is a piece out there that is by NPR. This piece is titled "What Trump's Pledge to Close Department of Education Means for Students in GOP-led States," and this came out in November of this year. And among things it reads, "One other thing I'll be doing very early in the administration," Trump says, "is closing the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and sending all education and education work and needs back to the states," Trump said in a video posted to social media in October 2023, where he laid out his vision for education. "We want them to run the education of our children because they'll do a much better job of it." And I was reading more into this article, and then they actually go into like exploring the plausibility of the Department of Education actually being closed. And it goes on to read, "Closing the department requires an act of Congress." Valance said that even with the full Republican control of both chambers, the idea would be unlikely to gain traction. "One reason is money," end quote. Another quote, "If you look at the states that rely the most on Title I funding as a share of their per pupil education spending, it's actually a bunch of red rural states that gets the largest share," Valance said. "You run into the opposition not just from Democrats, but actually a lot of congressional Republicans have real concerns about it because they see the threat that it poses to their own constituents." And then it goes on to say, in order for this to be possible for the Department of Education closing, another perspective from another article actually explores this. It's CNN, what the next Trump presidency could mean for U.S. education. And this one reads, "One idea is to move two major K through 12 programs to the Department of Health and Human Services as proposed by Project 2025, the conservative blueprint published by the Heritage Foundation. Trump has distanced himself from the policy paper, but a CNN review found that at least 140 people who worked in the first Trump administration were involved. Project 2025 also calls for the phasing out of one of these programs known as Title I, completely over 10 years. Roughly 60% of K through 12 schools were eligible for Title I funding during the 2011-2012 school year, the latest data available shows. And so I think looking at this stuff, it is interesting because there is the function of the Department of Education as we know it, as you name those functions, but there's also the aspect of like a fascist ideology, which can lie, and then it will create rules that kind of reinforce that lie. So it's like, maybe the Department of Education doesn't actually choose curriculum, but that's going to be the reason that the Trump administration shuts it down. And maybe they won't be able to just like shut it down with Congress, but they'll actually just be able to move it into something else. And then what is the Department of Health going to be under Dr. fucking Oz? And so when I look at it in that sense, it's very interesting because I don't know. I think we were kind of like friends were talking about this last night, but just like how the state and the elite are always finding these loopholes. And I think this is what was frustrating when we did our like season 1 voting episode, because we just kept kind of thinking, and I kept kind of thinking like, what's the fucking point of a system if these things can be possible? And so I think to me, a lot of their strategy, at least in closing down the Department of Education, is most likely going to be transferring it to another department or area, because like further down I have notes about the Department of Governmental Efficiency, and when you read into that, like we'll talk about it more later down in the run of show, but they want to get rid of like 60+% of the departments that the government has. And if you remove all of that or a portion of it, how many trillions of dollars could that be that you could just like move around differently and like maybe allocate that towards the Department of Health? And then the Department of Health figures out like, oh, like sex is a part of health, so we need to tell people to be celibate. So of course we're going to include that in the curriculum. And so I feel like there are so many ways that this could just go off the fucking wall. And then, yeah.
But it's also how much will the top down structure be respected the more authoritarian it gets. Because, I mean, because one thing is what reminds me of their whole the states that actually rely on Title One fundraising is a lot of Republican rural. Then Title One provides financial assistance to school districts for low income families, and a lot of those districts that are getting that federal funding are in rural areas or in areas that are also congressionally Republican, and that's why they would have some real concerns about that. And that also reminds me of the case of abortion. Even when Roe v. Wade was gone, a lot of federal attempts to do a federal abortion ban weren't popping because even Republican lawmakers were like, that's actually not what my constituency wants is an abortion ban. And that was actually cemented in the 2024 election. When you look at policies at state to state, it was like more than a couple dozen states that also cemented abortion as a constitutional right beyond more than that voted for Kamala was states that voted for Trump and voted for abortion. Um, And it's those policy things also that I think get folks to really just switch and change their mind. And when it really comes down to it, it's like, can we really fuck with their schooling? Like the politicians know it's a fine line of how much we can actually screw with our constituency for our own money, which is why they're smart about it. Like you were saying, they'll throw out all these numbers and be like, we're gonna switch, uh, the Department of Education civil rights to the DOJ because that makes more sense. And then we're gonna switch the federal student loans part and all that FAFSA shit. We're just gonna switch that to the Department of Treasury. And it's like, look, it's dealt with. We didn't need a whole Department of Education, and that's the the Doge effect.
Another aspect of how they're going to change education that I'm kind of interested in too is universal school choice. This CNN article reads that Trump supports universal school choice, which would allow parents to use public funding to send their children to K to 12 schools other than their assigned neighborhood school, including public, private, or religious schools. And I was researching this earlier, and basically it's kind of like if you don't send your kid to a public school, the government might give you a voucher or open up an education specific voucher for you that gives you those same funds that would go towards your kid going to public school. And then you can use it for tuition, or you can use it for tutoring or whatever the fuck, or whatever's left over for higher education. And so this is something that the right says will give people more choice and blah, blah, blah. But there's critics that say what about people in rural communities? What about gay kids that maybe want to go to a private school that is now allowed even more to discriminate because there's no fucking right to privacy anymore or whatever the fuck it is. Um, and so I don't know. I don't really have much to say about universal school choice, but it does also feel like another trick in the conservative trick bag. And I'm kind of like, what the fuck does this trick mean? And
So the one thing I can say about it that I know is a harm is transparency in education. And that's why it's also kind of confusing to see these things alongside the rise of right wing school parental choice education advocates, where it's like, yeah, parents should be involved in education. There should be equal opportunity for everyone in the neighborhood to be involved in the local education that's going on. Um, but these schools, this is also how Trump was saying that he's gonna make sure to protect the rights of homeschoolers, and because these public schools also have to deal with usually federal civil rights legislation. They're private entities, so they have a little bit more of a leeway to get around with stuff. And like you were saying, they do have a bit more of a history of discriminating a lot more. I do think there is an interesting dynamic to say that the quote unquote left or socialists should take up such a mantle. Where are the leftist educators building the co-op, building the scene to take such federal grants and money and help low-income families and build networks of communities. Because, I mean, historically, this is also where the whole idea of schools being mutual aid sites or direct aid sites as a consistent thing in urban and rural communities of it's the shelter in crisis, but it's also they're gonna collect cans of food for whoever's low income in there, or they're gonna have big communal days of sharing to make sure that everybody gets some and that there's a sense of unity. And that's something that is in almost every school, but public schools especially. Because I mean, there's also I don't know. There's this whole question of the fact that we mandate schooling. Like it's legally you have to go. We think it's something that everybody should do. You have to have these basis to be like a civilized or a good enough person to be walking the streets with us. It's required for jobs. It's one of the most basic things. And that can lead to a lot of terrible relationships with learning, with education, and with a whole different dynamic of the arts, with media. Um, and I don't think this helps necessarily.
But it seems like in there, you're kind of arguing that you're kind of for universal school choice because then it gives leftists the chance to radicalize and propagandize their children. Because if I'm following your line of thought, then you might be into parents' rights, which under Trump's ideology, Trump's platform, according to a CNN article, Trump's platform, according to the CNN article, I know, no, I gotta follow. I got a KO. Trump's platform calls for restoring the right to the episode. The title of this episode is Trump supporter. But there's a CNN article that reads, Trump's platform calls for restoring the right of parents to know what their children are being taught in the classroom, and to cut funding for school programs that push critical race theory and gender ideology on children. And I don't mean for this to come out of pocket or anything, but I'm like, if they want to argue for parents' rights for them, why can't the people that are progressive or leftists use parents' rights to their advantage? It's like, oh, I don't want to be taught white supremacy in school. I don't want to be taught fucking Adam and Eve. Like so cut the funding. Like, I don't know, because it's almost like these rights, parents' rights, but I'm like, there's all different kinds of parents. And like, what if we can fight fascism by using their own rules against them?
That's what I'm saying with the whole education and make your own anarchist charter school shebang. Start with some tutoring. I don't know, because I mean, but I think it's like acknowledging that central fact that they want to use this as something or a place that can be controlled. And it sets up control for them long beyond whoever is in power. And as long as they can get that upstart, that oomph, and keep a little cash flow going every here and now, it's gonna work out for them. Because even with Trump in office now, they're talking about wanting yeah, even now they're talking about like they need to bring back like the American civic education to the youth. So even in public education, they're going to use whatever means that they can to control curriculum, which is it's like the fear mongering that even just conservatives do of like there's too much power, government needs to be smaller, and this is how we do it. One big giant government sweep of power, but we have to have that mentality over and over again. So it's like, are conservatives really the true champions of the undying revolution? I am kidding. But like they're saying shit like, oh, we want to reinstate the 1776 commission, which is fucking crazy. I feel like we might do a read of that one day just to hit a couple quotes. But one of them is, quote, they're gonna talk about how teaching that it's, quote, a more perfect union founded not upon capricious whims of a tyrant, but republican laws and institutions founded upon self-evidence and eternal truths, end quote. Or they just traded one god for another, one unknown for another. Like, oh no, the tyranny of the king is not bestowed upon the divine rights that they have their relationship with God, and then they teach us the morality and how to rule and be. No, it's self evident. It's just, it's just there. And it's just eternal truth. And then we have a couple of rules, and then we'll fight about it. Did you want to talk about some of the Ohio local stuff that you found?
Even if they lighten up on certain things, I think what Trump's administration is trying to do is trying to literally restructure our government so minorities don't have as much protections or aren't taken into as much consideration. Like even the universal school choice, it's like, what if you live in Appalachia and you get a voucher? Where are you gonna go? Where are you gonna go other than your public school? How are you gonna get there? Who's gonna pay for you to get there? And so there's like all of these financial and geographic considerations, and so there's those issues. And then once again, I think with these larger national changes or national proposals, we will see these things also refracted locally. So recently in Ohio lawmakers passed forced outing bill with the religious release time amendments during lame duck. I honestly don't understand what lame duck means. I think that title's fucking confusing. But this is from the Ohio Capitol Journal. And this article is basically talking about a bill that was recently presented in Ohio. A bill that this article reads, a bill that would require school districts to create a mandatory religious release time policy and require educators to out a student's sexuality to their parents is on its way to Ohio Governor Mike DeWine's desk for his signature. This is something that was presented in Ohio in the past. It's something that is gotten even further this time around. And I think what this says is that whatever we're seeing on a national level is also going to be showing up in our communities locally, which is why it's important for people to be organized, why it's important for people to be paying attention to city council, what policies are being presented, but also doing that other more subversive shit. Because I think there will be numerous fronts that people will have to account for, even if you don't care about electoralism as I don't. We need to fight for the best version of these shared institutions, and school in the least, it's like to have the potential locally. And then even like what are they going to do it nationally for teachers to literally be instructed to out their students. And so there's so many unforeseen ramifications and so many permissions for like really bigoted violence that I think a lot of these things can allow. And this has been a part of their strategy. Like a lot of bills like this, other states and localities have presented this again and again through through Biden's presidency, trying to fight to make it happen. And now it's more plausible. And I think it's fucking wild. And it really does make me think about, I don't know. It makes me think about also, as I mentioned earlier, the Department of Governmental Efficiency and how this fits into a lot of Trump's proposals around the Department of Education and closing it down and shifting it and moving it into somewhere else. And I mentioned Doge, Department of Government Efficiency, because this is one of the things that when Trump won and I saw that Vivek was going to be in Doge and so was Elon Musk, I'm kind of like, what the fuck is going on? But to give you a sense of what Doge is, this is a article from Pillsbury Law that reads, despite its name, Doge is not an official federal agency or commission that requires congressional authorization. Rather, it is intended to serve as an advisory or consulting organization which, empowered by Trump, provides recommendations or strategies for government leaders to implement. Doge will be led by Musk, the CEO of Tesla, SpaceX, and X, and Ramaswamy, the former presidential candidate and founder of Roivant Sciences, who both supported Trump during the presidential campaign. Doge is expected to be staffed by individuals who share a small government ideology. And it goes on to say Doge will not have official government powers. As an autonomous entity, Doge itself does not have authority to issue rules, rescind regulations, terminate federal employees, or enforce federal laws. But what this could really mean is like, what does Doge plan to do? I also did some digging with Al Jazeera, and this Al Jazeera piece titled "What Do Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy Plan to Do with Doge?" and this came out in November. This piece reads, Musk has promised to cut 2 trillion. Musk has promised to cut 2 trillion, or more than a third of the US government's annual budget. He said he wants to cut the number of agencies from 428 to 99. But it also goes on to read, Ramaswamy, who will co-lead the office, said he wants to cut 75% of federal government workforce. The federal government employs roughly 2 million civilians. A 75% reduction would mean that 1.5 million people would be out of a job, which experts said will strip down a range of services from food stamps to defense spending. And so when I look at even this, if these people were already in Trump's back pocket, Elon Musk has been donating fucking $2 million a day. What the it makes total sense that in this next administration, class is probably going to be such a major thing for people to know how to articulate, because if the government is taking away the bare bones fucking basic scraps that it offers to people right now that gives us the assemblage of like a potentially equal or progressive, or maybe still a hierarchical society, but one that accounts for difference. If we don't have a government that accounts for difference and then punishes it or tries to erase history in the name of profit or having more of a budget towards literally probably war. And I think this is what is going to be very necessary, and why I'm also thinking of our Jamal Joseph interview, where it's literally just the concept of people are going to have to organize to give each other the resources and the things we're going to need to survive. If our government's fucking budget is cut by more than a third, what do you think public schools are going to look like? What do you think public buses are going to look like? What do you think our postal service is going to be like? What are our roadways going to be like? What kind of weaponry are cops going to have? And what will any average neighborhood of poor people be exposed to in terms of what the state has the potential to do if it cuts $2 trillion and is able to sprinkle it around wherever the fuck it wants? They want to reduce the number of government agencies from 428 to 99. And I think there is a weird conundrum, because when I hear that, I'm like, oh, the government's getting smaller. Why not? But then I also think a lot of people are going to suffer. And I don't think individuals and or collectives that we can see right now can really anticipate what it'll take to remedy that. But I think it's possible if they whisper whatever the fuck they want in Trump's ear, and there's more Republican control throughout like the GOP and what's in office, imagine what will be more possible this time around compared to last time. And I think that's absolutely fucking bonkers.
Baby, elite panic. These fuckers are sticking together like shit, fly, honey, and maybe a little marshmallow. Maybe it smells a little sweet to some people and it kind of looks like a s'mores, but it's not. It's hot shit. People are already talking about Vivek and Elon beefing. Elon and Trump not on the best of terms. Then Pence got 4 months. You think Elon's temperamental ass is gonna last 4 years? I said Pence got last 4 months. Pence lasted 4 years and almost got hung for it. I do think it is interesting because there are two ways to look at that. And one way is that, yay, less government. Like, it also is like, okay, 1.5 million people lose a job. That's a revolt. They know how to govern. They've been maybe people captured by an institution and repressed and can now be susceptible to radical transformation. Also, boo, this is terrible for prefigurative governing. I mean, that's also one of those things of like, I don't want to decrease. Like, I'm not going to advocate for the federal cut of all welfare when I'm like, no, we should actually govern welfare a lot differently because it should be more mutual aid. And then that takes a more encapsulating policy position around how we do and regulate around governing and what a business is and what is fucking taxed and blah 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 and what is incorporated. But I feel like that's one argument of like this really fucks up how we get used to practicing governing, but at least we'll go through a big change. And I do believe that too many big changes in governing folks get a little like, it's too much. We just need some stability. But I do feel like if there's enough, or if there is enough of a big change that folks are either really for it or they're really against it, like whatever you want to call it, civic engagement boosts, as people are either going to be like, wow, this is really good. I want to get involved to change it and be a part of how this is going to change, or this is really terrible. I'm going to make sure this doesn't follow through. And there's many different paths for that. And I do think it's very interesting how a Trump presidency is going to, especially if all this sort of federal restructuring does occur, what sort of openings does that give, or reimaginings? Because if there's only one federal agency that deals with immigration instead of five, do the math. I mean, that's a more centralized target. I mean, if there's one thing about the US is that it is decentralized. We have 489 agencies. Are some of them a little redundant? Probably. Redundancy is also a key to an efficient machine, but especially when we're talking about governing, more like shared duty, not double duty, which is something that I think a lot of people can relate to when being in relations with people, whether at work or with their friends. And they're like, oh, yeah, no, I mean, we definitely, these people own these $1 million companies, so they have to, at least in some way, know how to cut costs and do all that. But it's interesting because at the same time, America has this love and myth of like the anti-corporation. And like this is also something interesting coming out of Christmas season when you get to see the most corporate, anti-corporate media. And it's an interesting and lovely um, zeitgeist. 'Cause I feel like it builds a lot off of nostalgia. And I feel like a lot of the nationalism and ultranationalism in the US is based in like a nostalgia and in the myth. Because I don't know. Also, going back in when I was reading the 1776 report, it just reminded me how much of America is just this giant founding myth. We have our mythology, we have our pantheon, we have all of this bullshit that makes people think this is why America is so much better than everyone else. And some of the sentiments are true, but some of them are just folks now trying to be like, no, 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 we're great, we're good. If we need to work now, it's only. And I do think it's very interesting in how like they're planning this austerity. The economy will get worse, and if like you said, they can just move around $2 trillion, it's gonna go. I mean, I can see one thing happening of like there's been this myth of the honorable sheriff, the deputy sheriff, the constitutional sheriff that runs the prison, runs the law, runs the land. I can see them especially getting more money and funding around who's going to accept more ICE facilities. How are they going to use that money and be more efficient with it in a way that the federal government enjoys, especially if they're going to centralize who's even going to be giving out these grants, because it's not going to be 1 to 2 facilities, even though it's mainly only ICE right now doing the facility stuff. I feel like there's so many different ways that it's gonna evolve. And it's gonna have a very lasting impact on what the policing machinery for the next 100 years is gonna look like. Because I mean, even just on the next 20 years, when it comes to climate revolts, like I mean, we're talking about like the climate refugee crisis is gonna be terrible, and this is how they want to address it. Um, and I feel like that's something we can go into talking now is how does the US engage with refugees?
Immigration is probably one of the things I care about the most when I'm looking at the government and Trump, and especially how I think other Black people think about the government and Trump. and about immigration. Like some black people just don't care about xenophobia. And I think that to me is like extremely aggravating. And so I feel like it's something that I always want to find space to talk about and think about. But yeah, I mean, this year I did some humanitarian aid work around the border, and we're recording this in late December for reference. And I think it taught me a lot about how tangible our immigration system is, but also how, just like the prison system, it's also very much invisibilized unless you're trained to be aware of it or you live in proximity to it and it has like a physical presence. And so I think that's something that I saw how the border became more real to people last Trump presidency, and I wonder how that relationship that the average citizen has to it will change this next time around. Because just from the research and listing off some things that Trump or his administration has kind of proposed or talked about, denaturalization, aiming to end birthright citizenship, prioritizing separating families of mixed immigration statuses, mass deportations. Trump wants to return and expand things like the Muslim ban. He's said numerous times that he wants to have the one of the largest deportation operations in U.S. history. Trump's border czar said on family deportations, according to an NBC News article, it reads, Homan, whom Trump announced as his border czar on November 10th, less than a week after he won a second term, said plans are still being discussed. He said that if the Trump administration chooses to go with family detention, we're going to try and surge immigration judges to these locations. And he goes on to say, he said detention facilities would not be jails, but open air campuses designed for families. They are thinking about merging ICE and Border Patrol. They're thinking about having the Social Security Administration refuse to issue Social Security numbers to newborn children without proof of their parents' immigration status. It and I think with immigration, it's just the reason it makes me so angry when black people especially don't talk about it is I'm like, just because you were fucking brought here as a slave doesn't mean that you get to ignore this shit and participate in the fruits of this like evil or whatever. I think we really need to be I think we need to be very antagonistic towards these systems and try to like talk about it honestly. And I just I don't know. And I just reading all of this, I'm like, this is nuts, but it's all gonna be so possible. And I just I hope that the nonprofit industrial complex doesn't completely take over.
I mean, where do we really have spaces for this diasporic talk? Like, I feel like the most I've heard this is in a Wendy's, a melting pot of the diaspora, having a conversation, random ass people commenting to each other, just hilariously. And I feel like a lot of folks they're like, I'm born here. Like, folks that are descendants of slaves are not like, oh, I was brought here. They're like, I was born here. Like, this is like, I was born here. My family made and labored to build like the economic riches of this land. I deserve something. And now we see reparations are given and things are given to other folks. It's just more of a spit into folks' face. I mean, they're like, Japanese internment reparations? But for us, I feel like that's also one thing maybe this could show is that you can do grand legislative and research and logistical things with the type of network and federation that is the United States government. And even something at that level, but not operating like that, could instate something that enfranchises everyone who lives here. A lot of what Trump wants to do with immigration, a lot of his day one stuff, he's going to say it. There's going to be executive orders and it's going to go straight to courts. And bureaucratically, that's just basically impossible. Like, Social Security office has nothing to do with the offices that have data around the immigration status. And what if one of the parents is absent? They don't know the immigration status. And what if there's other people present at birth? Does their immigration status need to be proven? I wonder how many kids now will be put into foster care because their parents won't be legally on their paper because their parents are here, quote unquote, illegally. The Social Security Administration spokeswoman noted that the agency doesn't hold any of the data on immigration status. So that has to be verified with the Department of Homeland Security before issuing immigrants a Social Security number. So there's like already processes for this stuff to go on. Threatening to use and then using the machinery of the state, a lot of these deportations are going to be done with a letter. A lot of them are going to be people self-deporting. A lot of them, and like that's what a lot of this does, and it happened. I mean, that's how Anne Frank's family knew to leave. Was one of their cousins got a letter to go to a work camp, and they were like, I know what it's like out there. And then eventually they want to throw them into what they're going to call a quote unquote war zone, as Trump says he wants to go to war with the cartels. And what does that mean? He wants to deal with them like he wants to deal with ISIS? Like the amount of internally displaced folks we already have here, like this is not something they even know how to and want to replicate. Like they're not even supporting the Syrians in northeast Rojava, in northeast Syria, that they were helping and supporting to fight ISIS. And now you want to talk about replicating your ISIS strategy over here? Oh, hey there, neighbor. How you doing today? If you've gained something from these conversations, you might want to consider supporting us on the Patreon. Your support helps us cover production costs, bringing on amazing guests, and creates resources for deeper education. Plus, you'll get early access to the interviews and exclusive reading episodes. Head to patreon.com/thedugoutpod and join to keep this work going.
So are you saying that Trump's administration isn't going to hire tens of thousands of more Border Patrol and immigration officers, that they're not going to invest more infrastructure at the border? I guess I'm just wondering, like, are you saying that that's not going to happen, or they haven't done it before, so it's less likely? Or what are you saying?
I'm saying they can do it. I'm saying it's going to be clunky. It's not, and it doesn't need to be. Like, they are going to say what they need to say. Fascist executive order. The courts are going to be like, hold up, you can't do that. He's going to be like, all right, let's give it some time to work out. But also, DOJ, send out a letter. Tell everyone they need to get ready to pack. And then that letter enough is going to have people having their own exit plans, either going underground or going to different countries. That's going to be one way. They could talk about doing a constitutional convention within the next 4 years. That could be a mainstay that they could start having now to build more of a political movement from. I mean, that was part of the Tea Party movement. So they might really want to try some shit like that now. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that could be interesting about that.
They're going to try a lot of different things. Some of those things are going to work. A lot of people are going to watch as families get ripped apart. The reality of that, I think, is fucking horrible. And I think their failures to enact certain things is also just like an innovation in itself, because it's like they got here. So the fact that they're here means that more shit is going to be possible, even with the courts, I feel like. And I don't know. And I do get what you're saying. I just think it is another opportunity for US citizens to figure out how antagonistic they can or want to be towards the state, because I do think, yeah, the cops and the military can beat our asses, but what if it's someone else, or what if they're getting locked up? And I think that question, just intrinsically, I think, I don't know, a Trump administration makes it more apparent for the mainstream, which I think is like really weird and interesting. And they're gonna hire more people, and they're gonna increase their capacity to do a lot of things. And they already, people can barely seek asylum now. So I'm like, what is it gonna be like? Who's gonna be beaten? Or is Border Patrol gonna be beating more people's asses now at the border? Is there gonna be less? It's so fucked up. It's so fucked up. And it makes me think a lot about the necessity of community care work, about anti-fascist work, about especially looking at what things are happening locally, looking at what your city council is passing, what they're saying, what decisions they're making around immigration or ICE on a local level, Do you live in a sanctuary city? All of these are things that I think factor in, even looking at, like this was mentioned earlier, but the fact that a lot of private corporations are entangled with ICE and immigration. So, especially if you're in places along the US Mexican border, there's a lot of investment in private carceral companies. And so there's room to push a kind of economic campaign or a series of economic campaigns. Even in my own cynicism, I'm kind of like, I think people have been finding ways to fight this in the past. And what gives me hope is that we can help build upon that work moving forward. So end it on a hopeful note. If we'll fight it.
Do you remember the Rio Grande Haitian controversy with the whips and Border Patrol was 21? Under your Biden-Harris administration, there was a catastrophe in Haiti. Folks are coming up. They're like, do not come up. And it reminds me of also some of like doing work, racial justice organizing, when folks care about you when you die or when some horrific violence is happening. And I want to reject that. And even in the logic of nonviolence and in violence, of the more gratuitous the harm to the body does not mean it needs to be more present or more scandalous. Though it is a way to shock and to horror. I mean, that's like half the logic into self-immolation. But there is even this, because it's like even with the police and with border, it's not that they're using their whips, because it was also found that they didn't whip any of the Haitian migrants, allegedly. They were using an unnecessary amount of force, though, and you can even see that in the photos of them just grabbing them while they're on the horse, presumably dragging them a bit while they're on the horse, like, and then, like, even with policing, like, it's the surveillance, it's the constant harassment, it's the nagging, it's the breach of privacy, it's the breach of engagement and all aspects of society that keep that present, that force there, and keep that violence perpetuated. But if there's one thing about America, is that they really know how to divide and conquer their violence and only bestow it onto who they need to see it, and keep that a churning rat race.
I feel like this episode bummed me out. It's winter. Um, yeah, it's been a rough December. That's all I'll say. But I guess I have a list of questions, or we have a list of things to kind of consider or think about ending this episode. But I guess I'll point this to both of us. Where do you think are your personal areas for hope and your personal areas for cynicism around what things look like moving forward? And I'll answer that first. I think if I'm thinking of hope, okay, no, I'll answer the cynical first. I'll answer the cynical first. As I've mentioned a lot before, America is really good at repeating itself. And there's something particularly sick about seeing the cyclical nature of this kind of violence, whether it be white supremacy or fascism or fucking colonization. We're going to enter another very real period of this. And I think it's going to involve a lot of unnecessary suffering, a lot of suffering that is cathartic to the white imagination. And that is fucking wild. And I think that's something that I think people should just name or acknowledge or understand, especially if it's people that are just like, I can just go about my normal life and it'll be fine. And I don't have to worry. I'm like, maybe you should worry about the fact that the world around you could be going to shit. So that's a point of concern. I also think just the expansion of the carceral state and the expansion of the state's capacity to corroborate its own idea about reality, because ideally in any kind of like the government shrinking situation, I think that it should also mean that the resources that the government has is shrinking. But I think a lot of what this Trump administration 2025 and Doge, it's not necessarily about the government like losing its power. It's more about the government uh relegating its power to a smaller number of corporate and political elite and into a smaller number of interests. And I think the struggle that citizens will have to enact against that, the level of repression that we'll face back, I think that is a very complicated relationship. But I also think maybe the room for hope that I imagine is I think in whatever will be broken moving forward, if people really organize, there's the chance to really bring people into moments of transformation, of taking care of each other as the things around them collapse. And I do believe people have the capacity to do that. I just wish that more people had that capacity or more people helped. Because I think a lot of people will accept help, but how many people will like step in and help others or strategize around that? And I don't want personal suffering, kind of to your point, or suffering like projected through the media to be that reason. And so I think the area for hope that I feel is that I think there's a lot of people that voted for Trump that, to your point, are single issue voters, and those single issues might not pan out well for them. And then I think the people that fucking hate Trump are only going to continue to hate him. And so I think there is room for there to be some kind of magic organizing process in that middle area where those people start to organize together. And then the far left is coming in and they're organizing with them, getting them to think about decolonization. And also, I think the main thing is like, if there's any hope, it's getting people to be like, they don't need to think about who the next better president is going to be. It's like, what is our better future, permanent future going to be? Instead of waiting for the cycle to start again, how about we organize ourselves into a reality that can supersede the cycle? And I think we are kind of in an opportunity because I was listening to this astrology podcast and it was this Channy Nichols, black lesbian astrologist, right? POC lesbian astrologist. And they basically talked about how where we are, like world astrology wise, the last time like the planets or whatever was like this was in the 19 fucking 60s. So it's time to rise up, bitches.
Okay, I just want to let people know I know nothing about that. And this is what we love about same goals, different tactics. A revolution. Kind of cynical. A little. The hopeful bit is that going into this year and going into the next is solidifying who I'm fighting with and what I'm fighting for, and building out more sustained units of communication and aid with folks in different regions and in my own region. And having that network, I just know historically, is important for any moment of crisis, of revolt. I guess to say for that, I'm cynical in that I know personally that it's not a small crowd, but it's not as well connected as I hope it would be. Um, that's not saying that the power is not there, but when it comes to being actually even just regionally organized against or originally organized for a decolonial revolution, the cadres are building. They're not federated yet. Um, and I guess that's something I guess I'm a little hopeful for then, is being able to concentrate in my strategy and my local moment and what that means for like my own resource building and networking and organizing slash living.
Follow-up question. How do you think the nature of our relationship to political violence will change moving forward?
One recognition of it now is that I think we're adapting our common understanding of what political violence is in what violence is. Like, if there's anything that through the Black Lives Matter movement we've been talking about is expanding that definition of what is violence that is worth acknowledging as harm, and how do we then deal with that harm. And I think in this society especially, it's a very convoluted and hard question to answer, because we don't have the appropriate or resource measure to deal with harm, and hold people to account and to move forward and heal and be able to hold those who are harmed. I mean, hopefully we'll get into this a little bit soon, but anarchist historian moment, when any Italian shoots a motherfucker, like propaganda of the deed or anything like that, I mean, like, that's a known historical fact. Or when a senator decides to sign their name onto a bomb going straight to Gaza. Is that political violence? Or is the signing of that bill to give the Department of Defense more jobs, more welders, more capacity to destroy? Is that violence? Is that political violence? I think those are some of the questions. And I think it really gets into this interesting question in some radical circles, especially black political circles, because when it comes to the what is the police, because it's not just when they kill us, it's when they pull us over, it's when they harass us, it's when they discriminate at checkpoints, it's when they discriminate at DUI stops, it's when they discriminate when you're just riding your bike, it's when they discriminate when some white person feels uncomfortable, it's when they are just, even if they don't consider it discrimination, it's when they do their job as they socially see fit. And that's based on that locality. There's an interesting slash a predominant definition that the state is defined by its monopoly on violence. And some people then see this more proletarian, bottom up violence, whether it be a riot, whether it be a quote unquote political or even just economic assassination, as something. But they see this violence as something that is something to be, yes, this proletarian violence, this bottom up violence, as a role reversal, as a taking over the power of, you get to kill us so much legally, we get to kill you, and it may be illegal, but something to be said with the Mangione case is we're talking more about healthcare. One thing you could say about the Casey Goonan case is we're not talking more about militant solidarity work and what is solidarity care work, because if that's something that I am hopeful for in 2024 is if I can also find a grounding in what is my and my peers and the folks that I'm in solidarities with autonomy and organize around that, I can do that at the local level and I can do that at a regional level. And oh, that's taking care of each other. That's paying into this thing. This is governing. This is certain aspects of building and maintaining relationships. And depending on the scale, depending on how we need to know and how to know each other, I don't know. That's something I'm hopeful for.
I would say inevitably when police murder more of us and that becomes a flashpoint for major organizing in your city, be careful who you let into your ranks. Be careful and considerate how you confront counterinsurgency, how you practice security culture. I think we're very much in the middle of whatever the next iteration of Quintel Pro is, and I think that's something to really deeply consider. I found that there's a lot of importance around legal defense and legal support for comrades and community people that are facing charges related to protesting, direct action, militant resistance. That will be necessary. And I think people should really start thinking about, how are you acquiring resources that not everyone needs to know about? How can these resources help people in ways that not everyone needs to know about? How can we have above ground and underground organizing? what does that look like today as opposed to in the past? And how can we start building out some of the infrastructure that will inevitably become more necessary? Because I'm of the personal opinion, I'm not expecting no election 2028. I no. I don't think they're gonna let it happen. I don't think they want to let it happen. And I'm not going back to slavery. That's my advice for people.
I agree. I do think there's going to be an election. I think it's going to be precedent setting. I think it's going to be very interesting. Why? Because I think they can't let go of that prestige yet, but just yet. I think it really depends on what the resistance looks like throughout this next year. Because if a lot of people obey in advance of the fascism and authoritarian rule, they can just run a normal election and be like every other authoritarian, like a quote unquote normal election, and be like every other authoritarian country around the world where they hold elections, but they're so sham. But they can at least still say that. And that's very important for the facade of American imperialism, is this spreading of democracy. Though it's less on that side now, we're more openly spreading capitalism than we are democracy now, but we make it seem unified. One thing is then to continue to organize no matter what happens in the next 4 years, but building up to, I mean, if it's important to you to have a deadline, think about what's going to happen. What can you be more prepared for in 2028? What is, like, where do you want to be at? Because I know I want to be around way more anti authoritarian folks within solidarity networks. Um, And one thing you were talking about is when it comes to these police are going to keep killing us. And what does it mean to have not a protest every time it happens, but one big giant fucking protest? What can we learn from Stop Cop City into this movement for Black lives, for Black liberation, and through the history with the Black Liberation Army and solidarity movements with that was built with the multiple different movements of the time? I mean, we could literally have a festival for Black autonomous life, love, and liberation, a rally, take over a park, have a good fun, music, food, communal, community, security meetings, and then a day of rage. Been done before, could be done way better. It's a different analogy for what that could ever mean. But I do think that these are like the things that we could be considering, because even when we think about flashpoints in history, it's going to be the 250th year of the American Empire under Donald J. Trump. Get your AG. What does that mean? What does that mean to be ready for? What are they going to be doing? How are they going to be preparing? Does when we mean or when we hear people say your affinity group? We said it too many times for this to be the moment to find AG. AG, I mean affinity group. Google it. Affinity group is a group of people linked by a common interest or purpose, or they are typically, especially in the political and anarchist scene, a unit, like probably one of the what you would consider like a more smaller unit that moves together and has a certain agreement and principles of unity. And outside of that, they get shit done. It could be just your friend group. I mean, people that you invite over for dinner a bunch of times, the people that you have these rigorous debates with, the people that you have your workouts with and can engage in lovely conversations. And if you feel like you have those people in your life and they're not connected, maybe it's time to host a brunch, host a dinner, host a lunch. Maybe it's a walk in the park day. Maybe it's a let's go all out and clean the park. And maybe you all notice that something's wrong in the neighborhood and you can get it done together. Don't wait. Agitate.
Joe Biden and the defund the police Democrats have turned our once great cities into cesspools of bloodshed and crime. There's never been anything like it. Here's my plan to restore law and order in our cities and throughout our country, frankly. First, because police forces have been gutted by Democrats' war on police. I will sign a record investment in hiring, retention, and training for police officers nationwide. So important. This bill will also increase vital liability protections for officers because the Democrats want to take those protections away from our police because we want them to do their jobs and we want them to do their jobs right. You can't take their protections away.
All I'll say is Trump needs to be found in a dump. Have you seen the photos of him golfing where he's got the dump truck and those little white shorts? Do you feel like there was a column that talked about Hitler this way? Expand on your point.
Maybe because it's like, yeah, he ruled, but someone else could have just come in after him. And so if you target a leader, does that necessarily mean you're targeting the structural ideology or all the other populism that brought him there?
Enough said. What do you think we can do as Black anarchists to organize for a more sustainable, non-electoral based organizing scene that builds a consistent culture that can be federated with other organizing scenes? Like Jamal is with the youth, and you're an educator, and other folks are writers, and you're educator, writer, and then other folks work in kitchens, and other folks, and
I think we have to build institutions that are worth defending. We have to build institutions that are community led, offer things that the state don't or can't or doesn't. And I think we have to offer things and resources that involve some kind of education. And I think there definitely needs to be a kind of process that people enter, that community can enter, that is built around trust and trust through practice. And I think all of those things in my mind could begin to build a culture moving forward where, yeah, maybe that can be very intergenerational, but it's not necessarily we just need to get along as normal or just do things as they've been done before. I think there's room for, I don't know, us to really learn from each other. But yeah, I mean, I think disengaging from electoralism, I think that requires that we have institutions that are doing such good work. And when I say institutions, I mean like mutual aid organizations and initiatives. But I think like institutions in terms of like pillars of community activity that people can go to and trust.
in the next 4 years, under the Trump regime, what part of his destabilizing presence do you feel like anarchists, socialists, leftists, revolutionaries can capture on?
I mean, I think maybe one hope is that as the government and its sense of efficiency begins to buckle, maybe people getting certain social services will be way easier or hackable. Maybe, but even in whatever version of our reality that we have, I think we can make some magic happen on the way out. And it doesn't even have to be my way out, your kids' way out, your grandkids. Like, who knows what collapse will really look like? But I don't think collapse is short. I think collapse can happen over the course of like 600 years, and we might be in year 387 or something. Keep that with this episode, and I hope people organize. Organize. What would they say? Organize, agitate, educate.
If you've made it this far into this very long-winded episode, I hope that you can take the time to just look at the folks around you and critically think, what can we get done to sustain ourselves outside of the current system, outside of the status quo? I want people to think about what that means for them, if that has any meaning to them, because not everyone to have some revolution or manage every part of their life and be in a meeting 24/7. Like, that's what even a lot of anarchists think self-management is. And they don't understand like more autonomous delegation systems and recallable blah blah blahs that I think a lot of our politics is based on. I think it's something that I'm excited to explore. I mean, like I said, if you're still listening, I mean, we're going to be having a lot more in educational and curriculum based content coming out that's going to be a little bit more separate. Definitely going to be developing that on our Patreon. So check that out if you want to be a part of that with some group study, with some, developing what we are using and the tools that we're using to adapt, understand, and agitate, mobilize, and educate against the current status quo and current oppressive systems.